Coming up today on the show, Griffin Sturgeon of the Seattle Overload podcast joins me doing what Griffin does best, breaking down scheme, X's and O's, and specifically talking about the potential fit of Dan Quinn as the next head coach here in Seattle. He is scheduled to interview with the team on Thursday. The Cowboys being eliminated from the playoffs now mean that the Seahawks can move forward in any fashion they want to with Quinn. There are other guys to interview, but we're going to focus on Quinn here. He's the most natural candidate. And he's also a bit polarizing with some of you in the fan base. Some of you like the idea, some of you do not. Maybe you'll feel differently one way or the other after listening to today's interview. We're going to talk about the fit potentially of Dan Quinn as the next head coach of the Seahawks here in Seahawks Forever.
Welcome to the Seahawks Forever podcast. In-depth analysis on everything Seahawks. And now, here's your host, Dan Viens.
Welcome back, everybody. I hope you're enjoying NFL playoff football. It's certainly been interesting watching these games with a little bit different viewpoint now. If you're like me, you're watching potential candidates, right? As you watch those games yesterday, you see the Houston Texans blow out Cleveland and run up over 40 points, although including 2 pick sixes by the defense, but really having their way against that really good Cleveland Browns defense. And you ask yourself, well, Bobby Slowick, the young offensive coordinator in Houston, potentially a head coaching candidate. Does that make him look a little more appealing in your eyes? Ben Johnson, the offensive coordinator of the Lions, had a really good day yesterday, operating that offense of the Lions in a win over the Rams as they advanced in the playoffs. And then you see what happened with the Dallas Cowboys and the Packers yesterday with Dan Quinn coordinating that defense for the Cowboys. And as good as that defense has been, as good as his reputation is as a potential head coach, not a good day for him at the office yesterday. We're going to get into that with Griffin here in a minute. In the meantime, like this video on the YouTube channel, please subscribe to the channel, best way to support it, and get notification of new episodes. And if you prefer audio podcasts, subscribe wherever you prefer your audio content. But if you want to listen to episodes without ads, you can do so on Spotify. And right now it's just 99 cents a month to subscribe. And on the audio version of this episode, you will get bonus content, a couple of in-depth questions I asked Griffin that will not be included in this video version. For today, I wanted to focus on Dan Quinn and whether Griffin feels like his schemes would work here, how much of a similarity or departure would it be, how different might it be than what we see with Pete Carroll? Because some of you have said directly to me, have said in the comments of these videos that we've been doing over the last week that you don't like the idea of Dan Quinn because he's too close to Pete Carroll and you want a complete change. Let me know in the comments afterwards how you feel differently or the same after listening to this interview with Griffin Sturgeon. This is Griffin and I talking earlier today on Seahawks Forever. Griffin Sturgeon of the Seattle Overload podcast joining me today. Griffin, let's look ahead now. Right. We've kind of, or maybe some of us anyway, have gone through the process of mourning the loss of Pete Carroll and tried to wrap our heads around what a Seattle Seahawks team might look like without him dancing around on the sidelines in his hoodie. When you look at what's out there, and there's been a lot of reporting done today about candidates that the Seahawks have reached out to and requested interviews with, and then obviously lots of speculation around Dan Quinn being the front runner. When you look at the pool of candidates, and let me just put this up here real quick. This is something I threw together the other day. These were my initial top 5. This was kind of my knee-jerk reaction top 5. Ben Johnson, the coordinator in Detroit. Mike Vrabel, recently fired as head coach of the Titans. Dan Quinn, of course. Bobby Slowick, the offensive coordinator in Houston. And then Mike McDonald, the defensive coordinator in Baltimore. Those are just kind of my initial 5. Who are some guys that when you look at the pool of candidates that you think would fit what this roster offers now, and then scheme-wise, guys that you like?
Yeah, I like how there are defensive guys, there are offensive guys, and then there are guys that have a background on one side of the ball, but are kind of seen more as like a culture program-esque kind of head coach, like Dan Campbell, like Pete Carroll, right? Like Jim Harbaugh. So I wonder what direction, like, is Schneider just going to go, I don't care like what your brand is, whoever blows me away the most in the interviews is who I want? Or does he kind of value the like what Carroll brought in terms of like here's the culture, here's the program, here's how we run the team. If we get that right, then everything else falls into place with the coordinators, right? So right off the bat, names like that are probably like Vrabel and Quinn, right? Now, obviously Quinn has his defense and stuff, but I don't think he'll be calling plays if he's the head coach. I don't think he called plays in Atlanta. I think he'll let his DCs do that. So that said, also what is going to get Quinn a head coaching job is him calling plays for the Dallas Cowboys defense, right? In spite of his horrible playoff loss against the Packers on Sunday. So that might be a little hairy now. I don't know how Schneider will view that, but I kind of view them as like the culture guys. They run the ship, they run the tight ship, right? And they'll probably attract coordinators. I think that's why I'm most excited about Vrabel or Quinn, is because they make good OC hires for the most part. And they know like what went well for them and what didn't go well for them, and it's kind of sourced to their offense crumbling. So I think they would really focus. They would get the cream of the crop of offensive play caller. And even though some of these names are really exciting on the market that are offensive minded, the guys that offensive play callers that aren't looking at head coaching candidates, there's going to be a lot of those guys that are really interesting. So with Quinn or Vrabel comes packaged the prospect of also a good offensive mind, I think, in addition. But that said, I like what Ben Johnson's doing in Detroit. I like what Slowick is doing in Houston. I mean, I like them individually. I like them as play callers. I like their offenses. Where I might kind of differ or might come as a hot take for some is that, at least from a like marginal value that they're providing, I'm not sure that they're necessarily better than Shane Waldron. And I know that, like, Johnson has the hype, Slowick has the hype, Shane Waldron and his staff just got fired, right? But in looking at their offenses, I mean, both those teams, the Lions and Texans, have above average offensive lines, and they aren't necessarily better than the Seahawks in the aggregate. Like, the Seahawks are the 10th ranked offense. So when we're comparing to like what Seahawks had previously, like the Seahawks had a better offense than the Texans this year. And, Shane Waldron comes from Sean McVay and Slowick comes from Shanahan. So it's not like in hiring Slowick, you're accessing something the Seahawks have never seen before. And again, it doesn't mean I don't think Slowick is bad. It's more that I think that Shane was already kind of pretty good and was managing what he managed with like a horrific offensive line situation that I think is predominantly sourced to injury, making it so horrific. But that said, I mean, still on the play caller to manage the backups and everything and try to get the most out of them. I might argue that Shane, for the most part, did, but that doesn't mean Slowick couldn't come in, get Charles Cross healthy, Abe Lucas healthy, have a brand new notion of what he wants to do, and it could be fireworks. Like, I'm not against it. I'm just not as – I just don't know how far they would take the offense if the O-line doesn't positively regress, I guess I would say.
Griffin, I want to focus on that now. Let's do that. Taking some of what I've heard from you, because Dan Quinn is the most known quantity that's available. He's the guy that's been speculated the longest. There were even people that thought that he pulled his name out of consideration out of the head coaching cycle last season because some thought he might be waiting to see if the Dallas job opened up, but that he could see the light at the end of the tunnel in Seattle, and this is ultimately where he wanted to be. When you start connecting dots, like, it just makes so much sense. And the most about him, I would imagine, of all these coaching candidates and what he might offer. If Dan Quinn were announced Friday as a head coach in Seattle, he's expected to interview Thursday. I would think, given the history, that's going to be an in-person interview. It can be now because they've been eliminated from the playoffs. If Dan Quinn is named coach of the Seahawks on Friday, how do you feel about his ability to succeed here?
I'm not overwhelmed. I'm not wowed by it, but I think that there's definitely a path for, where this works. Like, for someone that didn't want Pete Carroll gone, I view the positives of Quinn as continuity of the good things of Carroll, or at least a chance at continuity of that. I think that, how well you run your team, like, really matters. And that's how you sustain stuff. I mean, that's how Jim Harbaugh is able to attract good coordinators, and how his offense and like, he can become an offensive team or a defensive team or a balanced team. He's willing to wear different hats. I think Quinn, obviously we know in Atlanta, like, Kyle Shanahan lit the world on fire. They lost Shanahan, but he hired Sark, and they had a really good offense the following year. Not quite as good, but then you lose Sark to college. And then the next OC isn't as good. I think it was a Dirk Cutter, and Matt Ryan regressed, and then he saw what happened. And they couldn't hit on their defensive draft pick. So, I mean, I imagine that he's learned lessons from Atlanta. He's learned lessons from Dallas. He knows, and he looks around at his own, the Carroll Quinn tree around the league, Robert Saleh, D'Amico Ryans even in San Francisco. And like, what's the common thread? His own defense in Dallas, the common thread are blue chips at D-line. And really, I mean, that's kind of the lesson for every elite defense that sustains it. You need guys everywhere. But I mean, pass rush just makes everything easier. And so it's got DeMarcus Lawrence, Micah Parsons. They drafted Mozzie Smith. I mean, the philosophy is there of just get dudes up front. And he didn't have dudes up front in Atlanta, like nothing, a far cry.
He had Grady Jarrett, and that was about it. Yeah,
that was about it. His best edge is out of the league, you know.
Yeah.
So he goes to Seattle. I mean, they've got pieces up front, you know, but not like the tier 1 guy. They've got like 2 or 3 tier 2 guys, which you can do a lot of, right? A lot with. But he probably, you know, he and John are like, all right, we need guys up front. By all means, there should be a guy at 16. One of those guys will fall this year in the draft. And then on, you know, when it comes to his OC hire, he's probably, I think Geno Smith is viewed as an attraction to a potential play caller to Dan Quinn himself. He's going to go get the best offensive mind he can to call plays. And there's a laundry list of guys proven and not quite as proven, but still have good reputations that will be available to them. So I could see it. I think bringing in Quinn would signal that Schneider isn't interested in blowing up the roster. I mean, he'd probably make the moves he would have made anyway had Pete stayed on. But I don't think, you know, it's like, all right, everyone's gone, but Devin Witherspoon type of thing, you know? So which I don't think it needs to be, because again, like we are only 2 months removed from the defense being on the track that it needed to be. So I think you take the skeleton and shake off the parts you don't need, but you keep that core, that skeleton, and, you know, you add a couple more pieces, get the right coaching staff in there. And, you know, you could be competing this time next year in January. So,
well, that's the intriguing thing to me, and I think it should be for most fans, is just to remind them, because there is a faction of the fan base out there that doesn't want any part of Dan Quinn because they want to completely sever all ties with Carroll. I think it's a small part of the fan base, but he's not going to be looked upon with as much excitement or adrenaline rush by fans because he's not the new hot name.
Right.
But let's talk a little bit about what you think we would see on the field if he's the hire, because, you know, Pete, it's well known, and nobody has dissected this as much as you and Maddie on the Seattle Overload podcast over the last couple of years, in the way he has tried to change his scheme and go to more of a Vic Fangio style 3-4 base defense, whereas Quinn still rides with basically what Pete used to run here, and the framework of those defenses we saw at the beginning of the Pete Carroll era. If again, speculate for me, if Dan Quinn took the job today with the roster that exists, and for now, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, Leonard Williams and Jordan Brooks are part of that. The roster that we saw end the season this season, that was flailing away for the most part at the end of the year. What changes would we be able to see as fans with our eyeballs on the field, personnel-wise, how guys are used, and how that might look different?
Yeah, you know, it's hard to answer, because when I think of the Carroll defense, he's had, for all the things that are kind of said about it, I mean, I think that he's lived in very different parts of his playbook, like Pete has anyway, and over the years. I mean, he's not just the 4-3 over, 4-3 under, cover 3. Like they've switched it up so much since then. So the term Carroll defense, like, really what that means to me at this point is really like how all those different worlds kind of what connects them. That's really like individual player techniques. That's, you know, like a run fit philosophy, like how that to me is what the Carroll defense is, as far as like the more tangible things that you can point to on a chart, like how much cover 3 do you run? How much cover 1 do you run? Are you running a 3-4 bear or a 3-4 under? Are you running a 4-3 bear or 4, you know? To me, that's just more like, who are your guys available to you? And that is where I have some optimism with Quinn, because what he's doing with Dallas is, one, he's looking around the league, like Saleh's playing more quarters. Like, okay, I'll play some more quarters, especially on pass downs. If I have a good nickel, I'll play cover one, because you can have good outside corners, but if you don't have a good nickel, you can't play cover one because he's going to be manned up in the slot. So you're only as good as your weakest link in cover one. He's also shown, like, year to year he's changed. So like he's even adapted within his Dallas tenure. Like in 2022, he was playing a lot more quarters than he was this year. This year he got Stephen Gilmore, so he started playing more cover three match in addition to a lot of cover one. He's actually, like, no one plays more single high than Dan Quinn, except for I think one other team this year. He's even playing more cover three than the Seahawks, or no, that's not quite true, but one high more than the Seahawks. So I take that as, like, I'm not going to pigeonhole him. He'll look at the roster and be like, all right, with Devin Witherspoon in the slot, I can play cover one when I need to. I've got the bodies up front to play the classic, like, 4-3 over, reduced over with Red Bryant, which looks a lot like a 3-4, even though, I mean, it kind of functions like one, at least against the run. It kind of doesn't. He can have a bear package. I mean, he liked using the bear package when he was in Seattle, which bear is effectively a 3-4, kind of a 3-4, like a reduced 3-4. Really, I mean, my answer to that is I have no idea, because he can live in the Chris Richard era, the Chris Richard world of the playbook. He can live in the Ken Norton Jr. part. He can live in some of the Clint Hurtt stuff, which the best parts overlap with what he's doing in Dallas right now. So I mean, he can just combine it and react to his personnel. So I would hope his guiding ethos would be, let's just respond to the players that I have, but then most importantly, fill out the rest of my staff to coach them, so that to make sure that that they're executing. Because I don't think by the end, Clint Hurtt's ideas, on paper ideas, was what was failing him. I think it was his ability to communicate the ideas to his players and get otherwise talented players executing the right way. I think that's where Quinn wouldn't screw up. I mean, over the last 3 years in Dallas, in spite of how he did against the Packers, over the last 3 years in Dallas, the Cowboys are the best defense in the NFL, at least by EPA. So he sustained really high play. And, you could say, well, look at his talent. Yeah, but if you give him talent, he's proven he won't screw it up. Like, he didn't screw up the Legion of Boom, right?
Right.
He didn't have talent in Atlanta. Now, did he get them playing better than they were? No, but he also wasn't gifted a bunch of talent that he screwed up either. So I think in Seattle, he'd have a lot more talent than he did in Atlanta, at least year one.
You touch on something really interesting there about his adaptability. One of the main complaints that I hear time and time again from Seahawks fans is too much soft zone, playing off guys. And also maybe kind of piggybacking on that, not aggressive enough. Don't disguise coverages. We don't really blitz enough, right? With what they have on hand, with guys, Reek Woolen, Devin Witherspoon, some of the other young cornerbacks there, do you think that Dan would tend to play more man, or do you think that's a complaint from fans that maybe has been a little misguided?
So I think that he probably would lean into man coverage. I think that in 2022 anyway, the Seahawks, this might surprise some people, but when rushing four, so rush four, cover three, just like standard classic cover three, the Seahawks in 2022 for the whole season were the best cover three team. Like, they were no one better. So they have the personnel in the backs. And also that was without Devin Witherspoon, right? So you're upgrading Kobe from now. I think Bobby's part of why they regressed in cover three, because you need your hook players, your linebackers to be good. But anyway, they still have enough of that 2022 group on the team still, that if he wants to be a cover three team, they can. Now, the way the Seahawks used cover three, though, that year, it was an aggressive form of cover three where they're carrying both seams, and it's giving you the same schematic effect that cover one would. So the Seahawks technically didn't play cover one, but they were embracing the concept of it via their cover three. Whether Quinn wants to do that version of cover three or just play man, personally, I don't care. But I do think the intention would be, let's man up, let's mark up. That also allows us to load the box when you're in cover one or match cover three. If you load the box, that lets your pass rushers to be more aggressive against the pass too. So there is in some ways where cover three, cover one puts your pass rushers at an advantage, which can in turn help your coverage, right? So I do think that, long story short, he would embrace the idea of, let's get aggressive one-on-one coverage, whether it's zone or man, more notions of one-on-one match coverage with his pass rushers always rushing the passer. I definitely think that would be a primary feature of the defense.
Now, of course, the first concern on any fan's mind when evaluating a new coach is going to be how can they compete in our division, right? Yeah, the San Francisco 49ers might be the best team in the league. You have the Rams who exceeded expectations this year, just get knocked out by the Lions yesterday, but they look like a team that's young now and their cap issues are behind them, and maybe they're ascending. The Cowboys played the 49ers in week 5 this year, and they got run 42-10. Brock Purdy had a huge day with 4 touchdown passes. They gave up 170 yards on the ground. It was kind of just sort of a full display of the 49ers offensive firepower. Does that concern you, the fact that at least in that small sample size, that one game, they weren't able to match up with that offense?
Yeah, no, it's concerning. I think for the 49ers, though, they are like, honestly, like they're one of the 5 best, most efficient offenses like ever this year, right? I don't think it's possible for them to remain this good next year or the year after. I think that they're doomed to regress a little bit, and they are going to have to make some contract decisions. So my general thing with this is, like, as we all know, the NFL isn't static. These things ebb and flow. I mean, the Seahawks sustaining the defense that they did for 4 years, 5 years of the Legion of Boom is like unprecedented. If the 49ers are as good right now as they are next year, it would be pretty darn close to unprecedented. So I'm going to bank on like just the variance bug biting them a little bit, and they're going to come down a little bit. Now, that doesn't mean Dan Quinn's done well against Shanahan. I think actually, so Deontay Lee of The Athletic, he tweeted today, Dan Quinn as a DC or head coach is 2-3 against Shanahan, 0-3 against Matt LaFleur, 4-1 against Sean McVay. Yeah. So it's a little, it's kind of all over the map. And then you wonder, how much is this just individual versus individual and not necessarily tree versus tree? How much of it is circumstantial, matchups of his individual personnel? The way I see it is, I think that the Seahawks roster has the potential in it to be a top 10 defense, especially if they make, a couple of tweaks that are within their means to make. And I think that the offense itself, if the O-line just gets better, and then, say you get a hotshot OC that you really like, I think the Seahawks can be a 13-win team. That's a lot of if and buts. I'm just saying, I think it's within their, it might be one of the more unlikelier scenarios, but I think it's plausible. So, whoever they hire is going to have their work cut out for them in this division. I'm not dissuaded by Quinn for Quinn reasons necessarily. Whatever I'm dissuaded by, it's just because Shanahan is Shanahan, and we just have to hope that the 49ers crumble a little bit.
And on the positive side, as you mentioned, even this year, they did play the Rams and they shut down that offense, albeit that's a game where Stafford got hurt and Brett Rippon had to come in and play a little bit. But yeah, that was a convincing win. And as you mentioned, he's had success against McVay. One more question focusing on the defense, and then I want to talk about some offense before I let you go. I asked you this the other day on Twitter. And again, focusing on Dan Quinn, if he were to come in, you'd think he would want, I would think Leonard Williams would be a priority, as I think it is for John Schneider, to try and bring him back, as well as Jordan Brooks. And I asked you this, and I was intrigued by your answer. If you could only have one, if you can only afford one of those guys, Leonard Williams, Jordan Brooks, who's the more important of the two to bring back?
Yeah, I said Jordan Brooks. I think my premise is that, again, it's another one of my probably unpopular opinions. I simply think Jordan Brooks is one of the 5, 6, or 7 best linebackers in the league, off-ball linebackers, guys that are 240 with his change of direction, that can turn and run with seam routes, that know where the dig route windows are. Just so few of them exist. You might find a guy who can do all that stuff at 230, but then he can't give you anything in the run game, like Cody Barton.
Yeah. And those guys seem to be much more common now coming out of college.
Right. I mean, Brooks, to me, it's like Fred Warner's at the top, but then you get into guys like Raquan Smith, Matt Milano, Demario Davis, and I'll throw Jordan Brooks right after those guys. I really think he's that kind of guy. And I think that the value, especially as the league transitions to too high, when you're going too high, you're taking more pressure off the linebackers, but the ceiling of a too high team, I think, is really like what your middle linebacker can do, because that's what opens up your coverage menu. If he can carry a seam route, then that weak side single, or that weak side high safety, now he can double the lone X receiver on the other side. If he can't, if that Mike can't carry a guy, then he has to double someone coming off from the passing strength, and then now your weak side corners in the one-on-one situation, just like he would be in cover 3. So like, is it really too high at that point? I mean, it is, but it's just that Mike gives you the flexibility that, I mean, any DC wants. I mean, when I think Vic Fangio, the first player that comes to mind is Patrick Willis. You know, like people like, you know, too high. You know, when I think Vic Fangio again, I'm thinking, well, Roquan Smith in Chicago, like when they had an elite defense. So like Fangio hasn't had an elite defense actually without an elite middle linebacker. Like it didn't go as well in Denver as it could have. It's not going great in Miami. It's going okay, but not great. Brandon Staley managed without a good Mike in LA for 1 year, but that was with Jalen Ramsey and Aaron Donald having the best seasons of their career, you know, and they're already incredible players. Otherwise, I'm looking around the league. I'm like, these guys need a good, a lot of these 2-eye teams need a good middle linebacker. And I think the Seahawks had one in 2022, but then they moved him to Will. And it's just they don't ask the Will to do as many important things as they do the Mike. And I think it hurt them. So I would bring him back. Because if you don't, then like you have to use one of your more premium picks on a linebacker. You're just giving yourself
start from scratch in that case.
Yeah. And so I'm like, you know, just cut Jamal and use the proceeds to pay Jordan, you know? So yeah, that's where I'm at with that. Also, I think it's easier to find Leonard Williams. It's easier to find defensive linemen than it is to find that kind of blue chip-esque middle linebacker. It's still hard to find them at D-line, don't get me wrong, but I just think like that's the most rare defensive player right now, archetype wise.
Let's talk about offense for a minute. If it's Dan Quinn, do you think he'd be more likely than maybe some of these other young candidates to favor bringing Geno back and just roll with him, regardless of whether or not they draft a guy to groom for the future?
You know, I don't know. I don't know how to judge what a defensive guy would think with Geno versus an offensive guy. A defensive guy might say, like Quinn, like you said, might go, okay, you know, we can get off the ground immediately, at least with Geno. I don't need to worry too much about the offense. But at the same time, an offensive guy might be like, hey, give me Geno. I can do something with this. So I don't know how to view it through that lens. I think that basically any coach is going to come in and say, there are obviously like, there are some good like second, third round quarterback names here, but there are like 3 guys that are going to go in the top 5, probably Drake May, Caleb Williams, and Jaden Daniels in any order. And the top 3 native picks are all going quarterback.
Yeah.
The Seahawks are not going to be able to put together a competitive package to move into the top 5, maybe even the top 10. I just don't think it's possible. They'd have to give up way too much. And then outside of that, I mean, yeah, sure, go ahead, draft a guy in the 2nd round, develop him, you know, 3rd round, whatever, develop him. I think any coach that comes in is probably going to go, give me Geno for at least 1 year. Let me show ownership that I can win with serviceable at worst quarterback play. As like a proof of concept, you know, type of thing. But then, you know, an offensive mind might actually go, you know what, if I can do with Jared Goff what I did in Detroit, look what I can do with Geno, who is basically Jared Goff who can throw downfield. You know, that's oversimplistic, but I think Geno is a selling
the same comp. Yeah.
So I don't know.
Well, let's talk about who might be calling the plays then to finish up, because the thing about Dan Quinn that he offers, I think, more so than those other candidates, is clear connections to who those names might be. And I want to start with Kellen Moore, who had such an interesting run in Dallas. You know, just a really young guy, was handed those reins at a young age. We certainly know him in this region from his time. I mean, he played at Prosser High School. I covered his dad when they were rolling teams back then, and then he went to Boise State and still makes Washington his home. His tenure in Dallas is interesting because he was fired. I mean, Mike McCarthy essentially moved on from him because he wanted to take play controlling back, and even kind of threw him under the bus at the time, said he didn't run the football well enough or to my liking. But when you look at the offensive ranks of those Dallas offenses, while Kellen Moore was there, top 4, top 5 in most categories during that time. Hard to judge what he did this last year with the Chargers because it was so dysfunctional and Herbert was playing hurt for most of the time. But what would your thoughts be on it? Let me just make it into a compound question then, because the other option is Brian Schottenheimer, right? Like that would freak some fans out.
Yeah.
He's currently in title, the offensive coordinator in Dallas, although he doesn't call plays. And if you were thinking about rolling with Geno Smith, you would have continuity because he's played for him before. Of those two guys, your thoughts on both of them?
I would lean on Kellen Moore. I think that the fresh face would help. I don't know if ownership wants a retread, even if it would be warranted.
It'd be tough to do both, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it would. Yeah. I like Schottenheimer. Yeah, for sure. I like Schottenheimer. I liked him as a Seahawks OC. He's coordinated a lot of different types of offenses, but I am impressed with Kellen Moore. I think the youth movement isn't. I'm not against youth for the sake of it. I think I would lean on Kellen Moore. Yeah.
And then maybe you answered your own question there, because if you bring Quinn back, there'd be the perception if you go too heavy into continuity. But you've said some things today, even that speak well of Shane Waldron, and he's obviously free to look for other jobs. He's been interviewed in Chicago. He may have some appeal to other teams there. What about the idea, and do you think it's something that Dan Quinn would consider, of retaining Shane Waldron for total continuity on that side of the ball?
Yeah, I think Shane's a good OC. I think whether or not Dan would push for that would be like his gauge of what the players think in terms of like player-coach relationship. I'm sure that's something he would value like a lot, because continuity can be a good thing. It can be a bad thing, maybe. I don't know. The way I view Waldron's tenure in Seattle, though, is really like the only areas where his offense didn't perform well, like those specific buckets, you can directly tie to like just completely inoperable protection. I mean, there's only so much you can do. Outside of the 20s, the Seahawks were like the second or third best offense in the league. If you just look at early downs, they're the third or fourth best offense in the league, right after the 49ers and Dolphins, and right up there with the Bills. So like the core structure of the offense with the O-line could not have been better. I mean, they were the best play action team. They used a bunch of motion, which, we all love motion. The sixth most in the league. In fact, they threw the ball a lot. It wasn't run heavy. They were a good short yardage running team, actually the best in the league in terms of converting first downs with 3 yards to go or less. But then there were some things that that were left to be desired. So like some of in particular sequencing, like the second and long runs, like that increased throughout the year. Like, is that a check at the line? Is it an RPO? I mean, sometimes it was, where it's kind of out of the OC's hands. It's kind of just your what you have designed into the offense. But yeah, I mean, I don't like the names that are available. Like, they run more than Waldron does. However conservative people thought Waldron was, these guys are even more conservative. Now, would they be if they're calling the shots? I don't know. No. I guess what I'm saying is I think Waldron's a good OC. I think it's worth considering bringing him back. But I think Quinn probably just goes for a new name and try to like reset things like mentality wise. So yeah, that's how I view that, I think.
Can't wait to see how it all shakes out. This is uncharted territory for those of us who do what we do and have over the last 14 years with Pete Carroll at the helm. So, I've caught you saying it a couple times a day. I catch myself saying it many times a day. We just don't know. We really don't. And I think that's one of the things that kind of makes us, it's a little scary, but it makes this offseason.
Yeah, it's exciting.
Yeah,
for sure.
What's behind door number 2 is not always, it doesn't always turn out to be the way to go. Sure. I appreciate your insight, especially as it pertains to Dan Quinn and his potential as a match here. And we'll certainly talk again in the next month or two after we know who it is and what it might start to look like in regards to player personnel and scheme. So thanks again, Griffin Sturgeon of the Seattle Overload podcast. Let everybody know where they can catch your stuff.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Maddie Brown and Ty Dan Gonzalez and I, we do a podcast called Seattle Overload, where we just, we look at tape. We will be talking about the draft. We're going to do a breakdown series on the 2013 playoff run. We'll just do live tape walkthroughs of those games on defense. So, and more content like that. So yeah. Yeah.
Good. And thanks for reminding me that Ty is part of that show now. It's been following Ty for a long time with both his Seahawks and Mariners content. So
yeah, Ty's great.
Pretty good trio over there. Thanks again, Griffin, and we'll catch up soon.
All right. Thank you, Dan. Appreciate it.
Well, how do you feel now? How do you feel about the potential of Dan Quinn being the head coach here in Seattle? Not just how he might impact the defense, how he might lead as a head coach, and some of those offensive coordinator possibilities that we talked about together. Do you have a preference? Do you like one more than the other? Do you have a new name? Might Dan try to recruit Arthur Smith, who's a free agent as a coordinator, had a couple of good years there in Tennessee before getting a head coaching job, or other names as well? At Seahawks Forever on Twitter. Like and subscribe to the YouTube channel and the audio platforms. We'll be back with much more later in the week. And certainly if there's any breaking news, look, if John Schneider wants to hire Dan Quinn, we may hear that news by as early as Friday, with the interview scheduled to happen Thursday. If anything else happens along the way, you know where to look. Follow along for more on that. I am Dan Viens. Thank you so much for watching and supporting the channel. Forever and always, go Hawks.